Historians often regard Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech as one of the great orations of American history, a speech that helped shape public opinion and propel an Illinois lawyer to the White House. That speech is still today frequently quoted and discussed, and its contents help us understand the growing divide between Americans in the years leading up to the Civil War. What is less understood, however, is the fact that the House Divided speech had a sister speech delivered only 4 months later. This latter speech was delivered by a fellow Republican and, at the very core of it, had the same central message as Lincoln's House Divided. Yet this speech had a vastly different effect than Lincoln's. In this video, I'll be exploring both the similarities and the differences between those two orations and why they were not received with the same attitudes. On a pleasant summer day in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln rose to deliver a speech. The day was June 16, 1858, and Lincoln had recently been nominated for the United States Senate by the Republican Party in Illinois. After his nomination, it was proper that he spoke. If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it, Lincoln began. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but is constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. Lincoln then conveyed his central message, and thus his most memorable line. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. In this opening paragraph, Lincoln utterly rejected the idea of compromise that the country had relied on since its founding. In his eyes, the country no longer could exist half slave and half free, but must become all one thing or all the other. Since the Constitutional Convention, the country had relied on achieving a balance between the power of the slave states and the free states, introducing agreements such as the Three-Fifths Compromise and the later compromises of 1820 and 1850. The statesmen responsible for these compromises had created them with the express purpose of abating slavery agitation. But, as Lincoln claimed, these compromises had only augmented that agitation. In presenting this view, Lincoln had to be very deliberate with his choice of words. He was well aware of the platform he was standing on and the party that had put him there, but he was also conscious of those in Illinois that did not see eye to eye with him on the issue of slavery and its extension. Accordingly, Lincoln described the division he saw not as being the result of the actions of one particular party, but rather the natural effects of compromise between the two different ones. This allowed both conservatives and progressives to understand what Lincoln was saying without feeling as though the speaker was accusing them personally of any wrongdoing. Moreover, the language that Lincoln used was remarkably plain, and the ideas that he presented not terribly difficult to comprehend. An example of this plain language was that famous biblical phrase, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," a concept that was familiar to those in Illinois of all social classes. In fact, Carl Sandburg, a biographer of Lincoln, described Lincoln's speaking to be so plain that any two farmers fixing fences on a rainy morning could talk it over in all its ins and outs. Therein lay the most critical part of his speech. It was widely accessible, and any two farmers in not only Illinois, but in the entire country could sit down and discuss its meaning. Throughout the rest of his speech, Lincoln touched on the pressing matters of the day. Among these were the Dred Scott decision and the Nebraska bill. In the former, he pointed to a conspiracy between Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, President James Buchanan, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, and former President Franklin Pierce. Although he stated that we cannot absolutely know that all these exact adaptations are the result of preconcert, he intimated that these four men, in regard to the Dred Scott decision, all understood one another from the beginning, and all worked upon a common plan or draft drawn up before the first lick was struck. Lincoln cited President-elect Buchanan's call for Americans to accept the Dred Scott decision prior to the court reaching that decision, as well as the fact that the court would only release their decision days after Buchanan's inauguration in 1857. Moreover, Douglas, the reputed author of the Nebraska Bill, made a speech endorsing the court's decision and vehemently denouncing all opposition to it. As Lincoln explained it, the Dred Scott decision, the Nebraska Bill, and the conspiracy of the 4 men who brought them forth constituted a grave concern for those who did not wish to see the extension of slavery. Lincoln argued that the events of the past few years had degraded the legitimacy of free states. If the Missouri Compromise could be overturned, and if slaves were allowed to be in free states, then the concept of a free state was under threat. In presenting his case, Lincoln was able to establish where we are and whither we are tending. The free states were being threatened by the institution of slavery, and the nation would soon become all slave if nothing was done. All that was left for the people of Illinois, and perhaps for the whole country, was to better judge what to do and how to do it. In a different part of the country at a very similar time, New York Senator William Seward delivered a speech to an audience in Rochester. At the time, Seward was the chief leader of the young Republican Party, and its likely candidate for president in the next election. Though 4 months had passed since the Prairie lawyer's speech in Springfield, and in those 4 months his House-divided speech had been widely read and commented on, it's unclear how much of an influence the speech had on Seward's own. As did Lincoln, Seward began by establishing the context of his speech. The unmistakable outbreaks of zeal which occur all around me show that you are earnest men, and such a man am I. Let us, therefore, at least for a time, pass all secondary and collateral questions, whether of a personal or of a general nature, and consider the main subject of the present canvass. From here, Seward went on to describe the nature of slavery in the United States and the history of the institution. Our country is a theater which exhibits in full operation 2 radically different political systems, the one resting on the basis of servile or slave labor, the other on the basis of voluntary labor of free men. Seward pointed out that all those enslaved are African, but that this distinction was only accidental. The history of the world had shown that slavery was not an institution created by whites to enslave blacks, but rather a barbarity that began with human society. After all, the emancipation of our own ancestors, Caucasians and Europeans as they were, hardly dates beyond a period of 500 years, said Seward. The next 800 words in his speech were dedicated to using history to compare the differences between the free labor and enslaved labor systems. Seward described the free labor system as the more modern form of labor, having been introduced to the New World by Western European immigrants, and as conforming to the divine law of equality which is written in the hearts and consciences of men, and therefore is always and everywhere beneficent. Slave labor, on the contrary, was one of constant danger, distrust, suspicion, and watchfulness. As an example of the contrast between free and slave labor, Seward commented on the vitality of the European nations. Russia, which maintained slavery, he described as being a despotism, while most other European nations were abolishing slavery and becoming more modern. Seward maintained that there was antagonism between those European countries that used slave labor and those that abhorred it, and that it was the antagonistic political tendencies of the 2 systems which the first Napoleon was contemplating when he predicted that Europe would ultimately be either all Cossack or all Republican. At this point in his speech, Seward departed from his lessons from world history and turned his focus to the United States and its relationship with slavery. Hitherto, the 2 systems, slavery and free labor, have existed in different states, but side by side within the American Union. This has happened because the Union is a confederation of states. But in another aspect, the United States constitute only one nation. Similarly to Europe, there was antagonism between the free states and the slave states, and these antagonistic systems are continually coming into closer contact and collision results. Following this paragraph, Seward delivered the central message of his speech. Shall I tell you what this collision means? They who think it is accidental, unnecessary, the work of interested or fanatical agitators, and therefore ephemeral, mistake the case altogether. It is an irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces, and it means that the United States must and will, sooner or later, become either entirely a slaveholding nation or entirely a free labor nation. Having already examined Lincoln's House Divided speech, it is not difficult to recognize the themes of Seward's speech. At its core, Seward's oration was saying the same thing that Lincoln's was. The United States is experiencing incredible strife between two vastly different regions, and the time for compromise is over. Either the slave power will win or the free power will win. Despite the fact that the same message is being portrayed in both speeches, the specific language of the speeches is what makes them unique. In his speech, Lincoln used a biblical quote to convey his message. Moreover, he made it clear that even if he thought that a house divided against itself cannot stand, he didn't expect to see the house fall. Seward, on the other hand, delivered a far more academic speech, one that was bereft of the sort of plain language that made Lincoln's speech so compelling. His tone also came off as far more aggressive. By describing the conflict as irrepressible, the listener was led to believe that there was no remedy to this conflict and that war was inevitable. At the time of his speaking, the Civil War was nearly 3 years away, and a vast majority of the American public sought to avoid that war. Both speeches were generally not received favorably by most, but while Seward had everything to lose from negative attention, Lincoln had everything to gain. Indeed, Lincoln would go on to lose his senatorial race that year, but his newfound popularity helped propel him to win his party's nomination in 1860. Seward, poised to have gotten that nomination, was viewed as being too divisive and unpopular among many of his own party. Thus, the lesser-known Abraham Lincoln became president, and political giant William Seward was pushed to the side. These two speeches were not the only reason why Lincoln rose while Seward fell, but they were certainly contributing factors. If anything can be learned from these speeches, it is the importance of language. Both speeches read as though they were written by men acutely aware of their place in history, but each man chose to express that understanding differently. It is probably not unreasonable to say that the individual linguistic choices these two men made had a profound impact on which man became president, and consequently on how the Civil War would play out.